Hi, welcome everyone. Good afternoon to this last and final day of AKLF. We're supposed to be three of us, but I'm going to begin with two. I can see Shabnam racing to the stage. Welcome to Calcutta, Shabnam. And here we are. Right, so today we're talking about three very different books, as in very diverse books, all of which have a sort of common thread, which is in some way, shape or form, they are in a sense a coming of age, except the age groups differ widely. At the younger end of the spectrum, we've got Shabnam Minwala's Zen, which is a split timeline young adult story about two teenagers called Zainab, who are a century apart and live in Kolkata, and their story. Then we've got Anisha Lalvani's, which is about a young graduate who finds herself in today's NCR, Delhi NCR. She finds herself rather isolated after her degree from the UK, and she's kind of struggling to get a job. Dad's just retired, and she ends up being a witness to a grisly murder. And there's a thriller that ensues. And of course, you know, the rest of the story, which we'll talk about. And the third one is Rupleena Bose's story about a protagonist who goes from, I think, 26 to 36 years of age through this city, Delhi, Edinburgh, and her own journey, which in some ways is damaged and stunted and yet kind of flows into a kind of organic growth. And it's a delightful, slow unfurling of a story, which I enjoyed very much. But I don't want to talk so much. What I'd really love to do is first ask the authors why they chose what they chose. Shabnam, could we begin with you? Is your mic on?
Is it? Yeah.
Yeah, it is, it is.
Yeah, so my book actually fell in my lap in a most unexpected way. One morning, a few years ago, I woke up and found that I'd been added onto a chat called Love Letters. And when you're my age and you're added onto a chat called Love Letters, you kind of perk up. Well, I perked up a lot. It transpired that the chat had been started by my cousin's husband, and there was a story behind it. My cousin Monisha, just before her grandmother died, her grandmother had slipped a few pages of a diary into her hand. And this was a diary of the time that she, when she just got engaged, and she was 19 in 1935. And I think for both Monisha and me, it was a revelation that this 19-year-old Muslim girl in 1935, in my head, I was full of stereotypes. I imagined a cloistered person, a cloistered life, very small thoughts. But this woman's thinking was incredibly, you know, contemporary. She was doing these little nutshell film reviews. She was going to fortune tellers, and the fortune teller told her, love will come into your life, at which point she bitterly said, ha, where will my life ever have love? But the most interesting thing that we realized in the diary was that she was having a romance with a Hindu boy in her building, though she was engaged to a Muslim boy that her family had chosen for her. And there were all these lovely little nuggets about, you know, she'd be sitting at the window and she'd write lines like, he turned to look at me. He has not forgotten me. His rhythmic walk is glorious. And along with the pages of the diary, what my Masi Zulekha gave Monisha was three love poems that the boy had written to her. And they actually scandalized me. I've used one of the poems in the book, and I actually had to censor it because the word that he used to rhyme with ripple definitely can't go into a contemporary young adult book of today. So that was where the book started. I spoke to my editor about it. She said, do something, write something about it. But I was chicken. I didn't know anything about the world in 1935. So I kept it in a corner of my head. Then the CAA protests, anti-CAA protests were happening. happened to have a conversation with the same editor about how my daughters were very involved in the protests. And she said, again, the same words, do something. And I think that's where the two stories came together.
Actually, it's quite, I'm going to not move. It's it was quite a remarkable thing for me to read about politics in a young adult book. One could argue that this should happen more often, but in any case, I mean, I was pleasantly surprised. But I do want to ask you, as an author, to make the political approachable for young adults, because they're often, it's not something they encounter in books normally. In Indian books, you definitely don't. And to be, directly political about it. It's not an allegory, it's not a metaphor. You're talking politics. Did you face any challenges? What was that like?
Well, it was difficult because I have my views. The people around me have our views. And I think, in a way, this was a cry from the heart, because I'm realizing that even while people have different politics, there is such a deep chasm that's being created between people with different ideologies that talking across ideologies is also becoming tricky. And I'm seeing how many friends I've lost in the last 2 or 3 years. It breaks my heart. And I think this was really a cry for saying, you can talk. You can talk across. You can even fall in love across. Whether that love has a future, I don't know. I find it difficult.
Yeah, because a romance, a teenage romance anyway, is one of those fleeting things to write about. To write about a teenage romance with, the two leads having ideological differences, that's not the easiest thing to write about.
So for me, what was really difficult is that the boy has very difficult views from me. So to write a character who could be romantically appealing to my girl, when I disliked him immensely, was very tricky. And honestly, if you read my first few drafts, you would vomit when you met this boy, Yash. But I think over, 50, 60 rewrites, he became more human, she became a little different, and so they were able to meet in a convincing way.
Rupleena, I'm going to now ask you how you decided to tell the story that you did. Tell us a little bit about the different threads in The Summer of Then, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah. So essentially, if I have to talk about the writing process, I do remember the moment, which was, I think in April, I was finishing a different novel and a different draft, and there was a moment when I had to go back to the draft and finish it. And by then the pandemic had just happened, so which was April 2020. And I remember reading somewhere that, there was like 2 reports or something, like very random, in fact. One was that air in all the cities have become cleaner, and the next was that you must wear masks because air is something that you don't share. And from there, I actually started thinking of the decade, which is 2010 to 20. And it was a very interesting decade, and I wanted to actually approach the decade from the perspective of this moment, and which is where I got the first line. And the first line of the book is, the protagonist, basically, that she meets a Zap in the moment of cleanest air of the decade. I'm not telling the exact line. And that's how I began the story. But couple of other things which I wanted to try out, because I had just written a third-person novel. I wanted to try out the writing of a first-person narrative. And I'm also a teacher. I had been on leave for a long time at that moment, but I also teach literature at the university. And it's a very interesting position to be in, because you're teaching a subject which is modern. You're talking about modernity. You're talking about, global literatures and, like empowerment and, all of these very interesting concepts. And you're doing it in the Indian classroom. And the Indian classroom it's simply remarkable. I don't think there is a descriptor or a word for it. So that was where I got the protagonist.
Why do you say that?
Because we're a post-colonial nation, right? So we are studying literature. We are studying about, Mrs. Dalloway, which I refer to, in fact, in my novel. We are studying about Shakespeare, but we are also, the moment you're doing it in the Indian classroom, you're adapting it to your, to the present. And the present is so feudal. So actually the Indian classroom and studying and teaching literature in the Indian classroom reminds you of the very sort of divided nature of our country and our city, which is feudal and modern. And that was the core which I wanted to look at. And I wanted to look at through this perspective of this woman, because we don't have enough stories of young, modern, contemporary women who are sort of at those cracks of feudal and modern. We're constantly juggling with the modernity and the non-modernity of it.
Also at the cracks of sort of being empowered and not being empowered, because your protagonist is, I think, very solidly middle class. Money is definitely a question. Therefore, looking after her dying grandmother is an act of compromise, which she bitterly regrets. There are situations with her boyfriend, then her fiancé, this guy Nikhil, where she is not as empowered as one would have liked her to be. And yet there is a growth through the novel, and I thought that was...
Yeah, like I wanted to look at a decade, because anything less is a less time span for me. I like long time spans, because long time spans make you give a sense of a person. A person evolves, and what you were in 26, you will be a completely different person in 36. Maybe you're the same, great, but maybe you will change, and a lot of things change you. So my novel, which is the decade, is very important, because the decade is where it begins with spring, and I divide it through seasons, because seasons also symbolize what it means in cities. The spring and summer is always Calcutta. Winter is Edinburgh, and there's a little bit of monsoon, which is Bombay, and there's of course the harsh November and the harsh summer, which is Delhi. So each of the seasons are also representative of how she is looking at the cities, not like me, but for her there's an element of fantasy and romance in each city, and that's how the decade is passing for her. And it gets obviously darker and darker, because we look at 2010, we look at 2014 with the advent of various influences in the academia, the rise of the right wing in the academia. So all of those things actually make her a different person by the end of it. And she's a temporary teacher, so there's also the
disempowerment of that.
I mean, the job,
you don't get paid much at the end of the day for all that position and the stature at the front of the class, and you're guiding an entire generation, so to speak. But if that job goes, she's in trouble. And that informs a lot of her decisions eventually.
And there's also about love and desire, which is again the thread, and the grandmother's thread, the partition thread. So multiple threads.
We'll come to the grandmother's story in a bit. Interestingly, although Rupleena's story is not a split timeline novel in that sense, but there's a bit after independence. There's a bit about her life in Nilokeri, which is one of those, I believe, never talked about Nehruvian projects. And we'll come back to that in a bit. But Anisha now, this is your debut novel, Anisha? Yes. Yeah, is your mic on? Would you like to share mine?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Yes, it's my debut novel, yes.
And what made you choose this topic? I mean, I have to admit, this was out of the three, the book I found the most difficult to read, because at some level, the isolation and the alienation of the protagonist, in many ways, I think stressed me out, probably because the protagonist is exactly the age my child or my would-be or my nieces and nephews are. And, this is, it's a thriller. It's a very fast-paced thriller as far as I could tell, but it was scary to read. So tell me more about why you wanted to write Girls Who Stray. Why did you pick this?
Thanks so much. Actually, when I began, which is almost 7-8 years ago, it's been a very, very long time that I've been working on this. So I think I was really driven, and at that stage I didn't think that I'd write a novel or even fiction. I was just really driven to just write, and it was manifesting in the form of kind of like personal essays. So I was really driven to write about what I think of now as kind of like two big themes. So the first theme was on modernity, in the sense that, how technology is affecting our psyches and social media and, the very, very fast pace of the world that we live in today, and just not being able to keep pace with it, really. So that was the first kind of big broad theme. And the second one was, on gender inequality and misogyny and patriarchy. So these two really, really big, universal, wide themes, right? And so I wrote one scene where the protagonist, who's 23, she's sitting in a mall and she's kind of observing things around her. And she's feeling, like I said, very just out of pace with the world. She sees all her friends posting on LinkedIn, but she doesn't have a job. She's procrastinating over getting a job. So she has nothing to say on LinkedIn. She's seeing her friends on social media, and she's kind of envious, but she has nothing to add to it. And just all of these observations of modernity that, you would see in a mall. So that was one big long scene. And then the other scene I wrote was about this same young woman who's walking around Delhi, and she has faced misogyny, heartbreak, pain in her own relationship with a much older man who's a property developer. And I wanted to juxtapose her kind of personal misogyny against this much broader moment of the questioning of misogyny, which I was witness to myself when I lived in Delhi during the Nirbhaya protests. So I felt like that was a very public moment of questioning of patriarchy and misogyny that I experienced. It was really the first and last. And so I wanted to juxtapose her personal heartbreak against this broader moment. So these were these two kind of themes that I worked with. And it's only much later that I realized that I could weave it all together through the narrative of a thriller. Like so many other people, I love watching crime. I love watching true crime on Netflix and whatever it is. And I think that the tension that comes with writing a thriller, it's very thrilling, right? And it can really make a narrative propulsive. It can move things along. And so it's much later that I brought the thriller aspects into it. And actually taking on from what Rupleena said about modernity and feudalism, I think there are aspects of that also reflect in my book. Modernity very obviously with technology and stuff, but the feudalism really comes out in the sense of economic inequality that I write about through the case. So the thriller is based on a real life case, which is the Niti Hari murders that happened in Noida. It was a 2006 serial murders, where a bunch of poor kids were found in the backyard of this very wealthy man's house. So I've taken that case, and the story is about this young woman who inadvertently gets involved in those murders, and that's how I try to explore the inequality bits. Yeah.
Could I ask you to read a little bit from your book? I mean, I think we'll do a little bit of Anisha's book, and I'm going to head back and ask Shabnam and Rupleena to read their excerpts, and then we'll take it from there. We'll have a few more questions after that.
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to read a piece where the woman, basically the relationship is over, and so she's kind of thinking about her own heartbreak, and also there are bits of the crime that come in. So driving around the city, light and aglow, bright yellow hives of amaltas scatter on me as I glance up to take in their wonder. Like a bride granting a wayward blessing to one in waiting, they shower on me all the goodness of the world. And blessed be the one I drive around with yellow blossoms in my hair and a heart hardened over time. Nothing lasts, I tell myself. Nothing remains. Nothing is constant. Not governments, not the color of the sky, not the pristine highway, not the cityscape, not nature's rolling on, not grief, not even love. Nothing is meant to. And I let the pieces of myself fall to the grounds of the city, across its streets and fields and waysides, as I exist above and beyond it, even as I continue with ordinary life, with this wandering across the city, with home and eating and drinking. Meanwhile, the world moves on. Indian startups are brought by giant tech firms for several hundred crores. Chinese and Japanese investments pour in. Industrial parks mushroom. High-speed trains zoom in and out of the city, new power generation units, a new highway, new automobile manufacturing units are built in the neighborhood. New airports, malls and shopping complexes everywhere. And you sit and mope for lost love, I tell myself, head shaking. But the truth is, I did not want to move on. I wanted to hold on to the past, to lost time that sifts so swiftly through the fingers. I did not want to welcome happiness and light just yet. I was not ready, still too enthralled to my grief. No, not today. Please, not today. I see them all the time at Jayaprakash Narayan Apex Trauma Center signal that leads to the rush of MG Road, now blocked because of the month-long Nirbhaya protests. But now, today, I don't want them here. The signal turns red, the car stops, I brace myself. The girls are at the signal as usual. Hasina, Shafiqa, sitting and gossiping, inhaling lungfuls from a bottle of acetone. I remember their names from the times I have stopped at the signal before, and I hear them call each other out. A dark blue bottle of camel gum pokes out from the pocket of one of the young boys sitting cross-legged on the divider. A baby crawls backward behind him, its bottom caked in dry shit. Not an adult in sight. Not today, I sigh to myself and then roll up my windows before they swoop like baby vultures. And then, Munia, Munia, shrieks one of them, shrieks one of the small ones out front I haven't seen before. Ye didi ko le lo. I freeze. Munia. And then careen around to see a small girl, 5 maybe or 6, narrowed down on my car, plastered against the tinted window. She looks at me absently for a second, then turns around to look at the other honking cars, at her friend who begs at some other window in that same nasal sing-song characteristic of all beggar children, begging at the windows of cars, of trains, outside malls and inside markets across the country. Munia, yes, but not my Munia, I realize with a relief. She's dead, remember? My Munia, your Munia. Hello Didi, how you are, she drones, half smiling with that same listless, bored look as the others. Performing a routine act like school, Lord's forced to sing Janagana Mana every morning at assembly. Sassy too, almost annoyed with her circumstances, looking for some excitement. I look at her squashed face. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. So, for me, I mean, I liked reading all of them, but Girls Who Stray was the novel that came, I think, closest to the exact times that I live in, you know, this very, very urban India, this very urban Delhi. And I think the imagery you evoke through your writing has been, I mean, it stayed with me. Shabnam, would you like to read out your excerpt?
Sure. So usually when I look at the audience, I size it up. If it's a young adult audience, I read the first encounter between Zen and Yash. If it's an adult audience, then I read the first page of the diary. So I'm a bit confused. I think I'll do the diary today. And I hope you all read the romance at some point. This diary belongs to Zainab Esaji, a record of events both in the wider world and in my own rather narrow life. 30th September 1935. Today I turn 19. Mum gives me a pearl bangle with a ruby clasp. Papa gives me a talk about how I must no longer behave wayward. Bhai Faizullah gives me a book about Bombay. Ben Fatima gives me an embroidered handkerchief and a box of Afghan snow. Her way of reminding me that I am not the beauty of the family. Bhai Kader forgets my birthday like he does every year. He rummages in his drawer and finds this diary with a seahorse on the cover. Turns out to be the most useful gift of all. A good place to jot down observations, recipes and thoughts that cannot be shared with my most unsympathetic family. Wear my new lemon odna ghagra with the white lace. Mum says lemon is a dainty color. Trouble is, I am not a dainty person, too angular, too brown, too talkative, too opinionated, too unruly. Too much the opposite of docile. Jiddi Jainab. That is what Mota Mamma calls me when we visit her in Surat. She doesn't say it with affection. Bobi Asma telephones to wish me for my birthday. Have never before had a phone call meant just for me. Feel mighty pleased. Ben Fatima puckers her mouth as if she has swallowed a spoonful of Waterbury compound. My sister is 2 years older than me. She is 3 shades fairer than me. Nobody would dream of giving her a pot of skin whitening snow for her birthday. She is the epitome of modest girlhood. Nobody would think of calling her Jiddi Fatima. She is a great favorite with mum and papa. Have grown up with the words, learn from Fatima, ringing in my ears. Faultless Fatima is engaged to a man who is handsome and rich and an acknowledged catch in the Bora community, from a family that mum rather crudely describes as 24-carat gold. Even so, my sister's mouth puckers if I get a pearl bangle and a telephone call. So that's the first entry of Zainab's diary in 1935.
And then, of course, you did this whole split timeline structure. And I wanted to ask you at some point, how did you go about it? How did you plan it? But we'll come to that once I've done Rupleena's section.
I'm going to read a bit from the beginning and small bit, I think. Nikhil and Zap were film directors. Zap directed stage plays and films. Nikhil was trained as a cinematographer and directed films. That spring, Zap had just moved back to Calcutta after a few years of trying to permanently live in Germany. Calcutta was also Nikhil's hometown. Zap did not speak about his reason of moving back, but I remember Nikhil telling me that the Art Council, which had promised funding for Zap's long-term stay, had backed off. I heard them speak of everything except Germany and understood that both of them did not like to speak about their disappointments or betrayals. Nikhil told me about Zap's work when we were in a taxi on our way to Zap's house. Yellow taxi also features, I'm glad. I was looking at the rear view mirror and wearing my 307 orange organza lipstick. The orange was like the flame of the winter fire made by the security guards huddled during Delhi winters. I rolled it twice on my lips. The taxi driver looked underage to drive. He was so thin that he could barely fill the large bucket seat. He tried to get a conversation out of Nikhil, the kind of conversation that gave a semblance of class equality. But Nikhil did not relent in these situations. I tried to make up for Nikhil's abruptness. The driver had to drop us at the entrance of the lane where Zap lived, where a crowd of people stood waiting. He told us helpfully that it was for a temple that had a good rumor network of wish fulfillment. He said he knew of someone who got a job after years of unemployment only when he had tied a thread at the temple. I had read in the papers that for one peon's post at the government office, 8,000 postgraduate candidates had applied. Merit seemed like an illusion that only belonged to the privileged. I remember reading somewhere that students had stood in the sun for 8 hours to collect a form for a coaching center. One of them died of a heat stroke. Two fell very ill. Did the rest of them get through to college? They must have all prayed. So I was telling you about Zap. Nikhil cleared his throat like he did when he said something he did not intend to actually say. Zap started directing stage plays only when he was in college. He was invited to take over a big musical production of Alice in Wonderland by the British theatre company that wanted to bring the expensive theatre experience to India. Zap hated the idea, but he wanted to move out of Calcutta, Nikhil added. Anyway, that was a decade back. Zap moved from theatre to films and is now back to Calcutta. He will probably walk through both art forms. Can you believe? He barely visited Calcutta the decade he was abroad. Nikhil continued the conversation while we passed the queue of people waiting to make their wish. I had not seen any play or film made by Zap, but I had been told that he had been making films since he was 15. They had shown at all the big film festivals at New York, Sydney, and Berlin. You should know that Zap is very good at making people do exactly what he wants them to do. He is known to be a very manipulative human being. An hour later, sitting in Zap's house, I understood why Nikhil wanted me to hear those words. It was like the warning sent out by weather departments to fishermen after the cyclone had descended over the ocean.
That's the summer of then, ladies and gentlemen. Rupleena, there is this section in your book about the Nilokheri project by Nehru, and it's something, it's part of the plot. This grandmother of hers, who's now dead, has a certain part of her past and a part of her life lived there. And oddly enough, this was the first time I'd heard about the Nilokheri project or even read about it anywhere. And I believe that's the same response you've got in different lit fests and sessions, because people must have come up and said, we've never heard about it. Could you tell us a little bit about it in the context of the book?
Yeah, so actually it's a story which is a family story which was given to me by my father, completely by chance. That we had a great aunt, he had a great aunt who lived in Nilokiri, which was essentially, Nilokiri is this small establishment which was started in near Karnal after the partition, and it was one of those, rehabilitation projects. The idea was that the partition refugees would come and they would be like trained, vocational training would be given to them, with clay and sculpture and art forms, so that they would obviously it's very similar to the post Second World War trauma. Literature as trauma, as something recommended to cure the trauma of soldiers. In fact, I remember thinking about it when
the arts and creativity coming in as therapy.
Therapy, yeah. So what happened was several people who went from Shantiniketan, who were actually, working and doing apprenticeships in Shantiniketan, they went to Nilokiri because it was a part of this large project which would be like a settlement of artists and intellectuals. Unfortunately, it was a failed project because, the time was probably not right. It was, it was in Karnal, in the middle of a dairy district. It's not Bengal or it's not Shantiniketan. But this big chunk of years are sort of, I felt they were unrepresented. So when I got this story, I just thought at that time I wanted to do a big partition novel, which was not, the time was not right for that. So then I thought that I must use this story because I wanted to refer to, generational trauma, wanted to refer to this whole idea of inheriting a sense of, things which you inherit unwittingly, right? Mistakes which you sort of keep repeating. So for that, I wanted the subplot, the sub-story of the grandmother, and the grandmother's Nilokiri story was something which was necessary to parallel the story of this protagonist as an artist. So these two sort of work in this whole way of, cities, feudalism, and the artist.
Yeah, the concept of, inherited loss and sort of the rhythm of the repetition. And yet, of course, she ends up redeeming herself far better thanks to perhaps the times that we live in to some extent. So, both Anisha and Rupleena, this is more for you than for Shabnam. You've written these lead characters who are not necessarily very likable or very relatable. They could be called perhaps difficult characters. What made you choose such a character to write, and how did you sort of go about perhaps imbuing them with some qualities that would make the average reader kind of identify, like them a little bit? Or did you not feel the pressure at all? Did you just say, whichever way the story took them is the way they'd go? Anisha?
Yeah, sure. So, while I was writing it, I wasn't really conscious of all of these things, but it only came much later. I think that, historically women, women have to be likable, right? Like that's society's perception, women as mother, nurturer, etc. And, like traditionally women characters have always had to be likable for, there has to be an element of relatability in portrayed in women in fiction. And I think the time has really come to change that, it's as simple as that really, and really portray women as complicated characters, full of contradictions, which we all are, right? Men, women, all genders. And so it's as simple as that. I just wanted to portray somebody who was, just the way I think about my friends, men or women or all genders, just somebody complex and complicated and full of contradictions. And so I didn't go out of my way to make her unlikable, but just make her as real to kind of real life as possible. Yeah, that's all.
Basically, the temptation to sort of make everybody like the lead character is not something you felt you needed to kind of worry about. It was led by the...
Yeah, I think there are, because I think the driving force of literature or a protagonist or a character, there's something bigger than likability, and there can be a deeply, I think it's compulsion or an element of being compelling that's more important. So there can be deeply, characters that are just horrible, but just deeply compelling, right? That kind of make you want to read them. So, which is not my protagonist at all. She's not deeply unlikable or deeply likable. I just
No, just a character with enough realism, enough shades of grey, who also happens to be a young woman, and therefore the question, because the temptation always is to sort of nudge the female lead to a more palatable, popular, likable kind of a slot.
Yes.
Rupleena, this same but different for you in the.
No, same. I don't think you think about whether to make someone likable or dislikable, because it's honestly not. Broadly, also at some point the novel also writes itself. So there are various things which you don't plan when you begin, and it sort of unfolds. But having said that, I will say that I was very, very interested in writing. I mean, I was consciously, two things I was conscious of: first person narrative, a woman, female character who is a teacher of literature, because then you see the personal and the political, which when I started the book. Because I was also looking at, the tradition of women, I mean, like a lot of writing in the West, which was Rachel Cusk, who they were all talking about this, professors who would go for a residency and observe the world. And I remember feeling that why can't one write like that in India? And of course, like Levy, Elena Ferrante, Rachel Cusk, and of course, Oran Pamuk, and their sense of the interior and the exterior, the city and the street and your own self and something which is inside you, that is something that I really wanted to draw upon. I wanted to write something which is of my country, of the cities where you live, and where the protagonist is a person like that, introspective and yet, constantly talking about class or caste or politics.
This is very interesting because, I have two leads who are women where the authors have consciously, clearly not decided to make them likable or less likable. Yet you had Yash as the male protagonist, who you had to work towards making him a little bit likable. And I wonder why you felt the pressure to make him likable at all.
I think mainly to make the romance credible. If the boy is a monster, your characters are your readers are just going to be offended from page one. And there was clearly some chemistry there between them, because I think Zen also, she's a likable character, but she's a very closed character. And, when I was actually writing the book, one thing I did was whenever Zen talks to anybody in her family or the wider world, she talks in very brief, tiny sentences. I actually counted the words. But when she talks to Yash, something strange happens, and she talks in much longer sentences. She doesn't think so much before. She just blurts things out. So there had to be some magic in the boy, something. So I haven't changed his politics too much, but his rough edges, his more obvious obnoxiousness, I had to file away a little. Because, just to make it a romance palatable to young adults, palatable to me. When I started the book, my daughters told me, this is horrible. How can you stick Zen with a boy like this? The only happy ending to this book is an unhappy ending. And so I started this book in great terror, thinking, how am I going to end this? Because, when you grow up, black and white is not so, at my age, black and white is not so clearly delineated. There are many shades of grey in the middle, and that's where I finally fell.
Yeah, I thought actually it was quite a brave thing to do. In a young adult book, you're introducing romance into it, and you're introducing somebody who, at least half your readers may absolutely abhor. And then, how do you kind of work with that? But the one question I think Shabnam, I cannot include you, but I have to include Anisha and Rupleena, especially when I read, where does sexual agency fit in your stories? There's a fair bit of sex in the stories, but I found that the two books were very different in the way they dealt with it, and I wanted to kind of sort of end with this.
Yeah, sure. So in my book, the protagonist, she becomes an escort. So she becomes, in a way, a high-class prostitute. And I wanted to position her as somebody really enjoying that. as being, knowing that of course it's very problematic and of course it's, you know, morally ambiguous, but enjoying both the sexuality of it as enjoying the power that it gives her over wealthy men and wealthy and powerful men, and also enjoying the money that she gets. You know, she earns a lot more than she could earn in a conventional job. So I wanted to position her as enjoying all of these things, and therefore the sexual agency is an empowering force, while at the same time it's also deeply problematic, and she's cognizant of both these things, right?
And of course, it's quite crucial in this plot line.
Yeah.
At her, you know, about because she's a witness. So
Yes.
I was thinking of the whole situation and where that also kind of fits in. I mean,
Yes. So, I mean, without giving away too much, but the story is basically she becomes an escort and she meets this property developer and then gets involved in a crime with him and in a double murder, like I said, inadvertently. So, yeah, it's kind of part of the plot. So, I think through the thriller, I mean, I just found the thriller a very cogent way to explore much wider ideas, right, about women and modernity and society and all of this. Yeah.
but of course, first and foremost, this is a thriller, and that therefore,
Yeah.
how did you work with the pace of it? Did you do anything? Do you engineer or tweak it in any way, or did it just flow?
No, it's something that I enjoy doing very much. I feel like I get a real thrill out of writing a thriller. You know, it's like you have to be very precise and careful about how much information you give, at what point, how much is too much information, how much is too less, and that is what the pacing of it is. And yeah, I enjoy that, like I feel that sense of tension and I feel that sense of fear, and in some way I enjoy that, you know, and I did play around with the structure for thriller, so it's not like a police procedural in the sense, it's not a thriller in that sense. It's just about this woman who inadvertently gets involved in a murder and then nothing happens, right, which is what happened in the case, which I wanted to explore in real life as well. You know, bad guys go scot-free. You know, you just don't know answers to so many things in life. And so that long waiting period where nothing happens and you feel guilty, you're complicit, but you don't do anything about it is what I wanted to explore. Yeah.
Rupleena, same question. Not the pace, the sexual
Yeah, what
agency
was
one.
yeah, you know, because my story is a lot about love and desire. You know, that's like the predominant theme, I think, through which I am moving through the years. So, like, you know, where there's seasons which is outside, the external, the internal is this, you know, this love and desire. And also the fact that, you know, where do you go with your desire? I mean, you know, you are bound to make mistakes. You're bound to be immoral. So with immorality, with desire, I mean, you know, you obviously, there is the need, I mean, you know, there will be sexual agency. And there will be things which don't fit into the right boxes of, you know, domesticity or morality. And that's what the protagonist imbibes. But I was also more interested in a character which is Pat, which is a queer character. So actually a lot about his sexuality, his desire is also, and how that is used institutionally against him, you know, in a sort of rising atmosphere of intolerance. That is also one of the things which I wanted to talk about. So it's not just heterosexual desire, it's also all kinds of, you know, homoerotic desire and queer desire. So it's also something where, you know, it's a way of life, it's a way of it's your identity, and it's the way to sort of, I don't know, move through years and choices and, you know, like, I don't know, life decisions sometimes. So yeah. So that's where sexual agency is. I don't know whether I answered the question, I think.
No, the other thing I felt actually, interestingly, you did mention that the common thread that you thought about your book was desire. I really thought it was empowerment. Which was
I think desire, betrayal, empowerment, I think they are interlinked in ideas, right? I mean, where there's desire, there's bound to be betrayal. Where there's desire, there's bound to be empowerment. So I think it's kind of tough to also separate or any of these threads.
On that note, I'm going to open the floor to the audience. We've got 5.5 minutes for questions. Do ask for the mic and someone will be with you. Any questions? No? Well, in that case, I'm going to profusely thank my panelists for making a fairly diverse and broad topic and a set of, 3 very different books, so very palatable, enjoyable, and sort of connecting the thread for me personally. Thank you very much for attending. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. Thanks.